There is a town in the Ozark hills of southern Missouri that most people have never heard of. It is not on any major highway. It is not near any major city. It is not famous for anything. It is just a town. A small, quiet, ordinary American town, tucked into a valley between two low forested ridges, with a single main street and a single traffic light, and a population that has not changed much in the last 50 years. The town is called Hadley. It has about 400 people. It has a post office, a small grocery store, a hardware store, a barber shop, a diner called Mabel's, a volunteer fire department, 2 churches, a small elementary school, and a gas station at the south end of the main street that also serves as the town's only auto repair shop. There is a small park with a gazebo and a war memorial and a few wooden benches. There is a creek that runs along the eastern edge of the town, shallow and clear, with smooth stones on the bottom and crawdads hiding under the rocks. The houses in Hadley are old. Most of them were built in the 1920s and 1930s, when the town was slightly larger and slightly busier than it is now. They are wooden houses, mostly with clapboard siding and front porches and steep roofs, designed to shed the heavy Missouri snow that comes every winter. The paint on most of them has been applied, and reapplied so many times over the decades that the wood underneath has developed a thick, soft skin of accumulated color. White over blue over green over white again. Each layer representing a different owner, a different decade, a different idea of what color a house should be. The people of Hadley are the kind of people who live in small towns in the Ozarks. They are quiet. They are practical. They are deeply rooted in the place where they live, the way trees are rooted, not because they chose to be, necessarily, but because the roots went down a long time ago, and now they go too deep to pull up. Most of the people in Hadley were born here. Most of their parents were born here. Most of their grandparents were born here. The town is not just a place they live. It is a place they are from. And being from a place is different from living in a place. Being from a place means the place is inside you. It is in the way you talk, and the way you walk, and the way you think about the world. It is in the food you eat, and the songs you sing, and the stories you tell your children at bedtime. Being from Hadley means something to the people of Hadley, even if they cannot always explain what it means. In 1971, Hadley is much the same as it has been for the last 30 years. The main street looks the same. The houses look the same. The people look the same, or slightly older versions of the same. The diner serves the same breakfast it has been serving since Mabel opened it in 1953. Eggs and bacon and biscuits and gravy and coffee, so strong that newcomers sometimes wince at the first sip, which gives the regulars a quiet satisfaction. The hardware store sells the same nails and the same lumber and the same paint. The barbershop cuts the same hair in the same styles. The 2 churches hold the same services on the same Sundays. The creek runs the same water over the same stones. The year 1971 is a particular kind of year in America. The country is in the middle of things, the way it was in 1969, but the middle has shifted. The Vietnam War is still going on, but the mood around it has changed. There is less anger now and more exhaustion, the kind of exhaustion that comes from arguing about something for so long that the arguing itself has become more tiring than the thing being argued about. Nixon is president. The moon landings have happened, 2 of them, 3 of them. The exact number depends on when in 1971 you are counting. And the country that was once thrilled by space travel has already begun to lose interest. The way countries lose interest in things that once seemed miraculous, but have now become routine. The economy is uncertain. Inflation is rising. The draft is still happening. though it will be converted to a lottery system soon. Young men in small towns like Hadley are still being sent to a war that most of them do not understand, and that their parents are beginning to question. But in Hadley in the summer of 1971, most of these things feel far away. Hadley is not a political town. Hadley does not have protests or marches or sit-ins. Hadley has a main street and a diner and a hardware store and a creek with crawdads. The war is something that happens on the television in the living room, after dinner on the evening news, while Walter Cronkite reads the day's casualties in his calm, steady voice. The war is real. 2 boys from Hadley are currently serving in Vietnam, and the whole town thinks about them every day. But the war is also somewhere else. The war is over there. Hadley is over here. And the distance between here and there, for most people in Hadley, is enough to allow life to continue at its usual slow pace. The summer of 1971 begins the way every summer in Hadley begins. The heat arrives in late May and settles in like a guest who has no intention of leaving until September. The humidity rises. The creek slows down. The cicadas begin their long, loud song in the trees. The sound that is the soundtrack of every Ozark summer. A high-pitched buzzing that starts in the afternoon and continues into the night and becomes so constant that after a few days you stop hearing it, the way you stop hearing the ticking of a clock. The children are out of school. They roam the town in small packs, riding bicycles, wading in the creek, eating popsicles from the freezer at the grocery store, playing baseball in the field behind the elementary school. The adults work their jobs at the hardware store, at the gas station, at the farms outside of town, at the small factories in the next town over. The old people sit on their porches and watch the street and drink sweet tea and talk about the weather, which is the primary topic of conversation in Hadley from June through August, because the weather in the Ozarks in summer is always worth talking about. It is always hot. It is always humid. It is always either threatening to storm, or recovering from a storm, or in the middle of a storm. The weather is the shared experience that binds the town together, the way the cold binds northern towns together in winter. Everyone in Hadley is hot. Everyone in Hadley is sweating. Everyone in Hadley is waiting for the next thunderstorm to roll through and cool things down for an hour before the heat comes back. Mabel's Diner is the center of the town's social life. It is a small building on the main street between the post office and the barber shop, with a long counter and 8 stools and 4 booths and a kitchen in the back where Mabel's daughter, Linda, does most of the cooking now because Mabel is 68 years old and her feet hurt. And she has decided that she has made enough biscuits in her lifetime to qualify for some kind of award. Mabel still runs the front of the house. She pours coffee. She takes orders. She delivers plates. She talks to every customer who walks through the door, because Mabel has been talking to every customer who walks through the door for 18 years, and she is not going to stop now. Mabel knows everyone in Hadley. Mabel knows their names, their families, their habits, their medical conditions, their marital problems, and their opinions about every subject from the weather to the war, to whether the highway department is ever going to fix the pothole at the south end of Main Street. Mabel is the unofficial historian, therapist, gossip columnist, and social director of Hadley, Missouri. Nothing happens in this town that Mabel does not know about within 24 hours. The gas station at the south end of town is run by a man named Roy Tanner. Roy is 52 years old. He is a big man with big hands and a slow, easy manner, and a deep voice that sounds like it is coming from somewhere inside the earth. Roy has been running the gas station for about 15 years. Before that, he worked at a feed store in the next town. Before that, he was in the Army. Roy is a mechanic by nature, the kind of man who can look at an engine and hear what is wrong with it before he opens the hood. He fixes cars and trucks and tractors and lawnmowers and anything else that has a motor and has stopped working. People drive from 20 miles away to have Roy look at their engines because Roy is good and Roy is honest, and Roy charges fair prices, and Roy does not try to sell you parts you do not need. Roy's gas station has 2 pumps and a single repair bay and a small office with a desk and a phone and a calendar from the local feed company and a coffee maker that produces a coffee that is almost as strong as Mabel's. There is a bench out front where Roy sits on slow afternoons, drinking his coffee, watching the occasional car pass through town. The bench has been there since before Roy bought the station. The wood is smooth and dark from years of sitting. Roy likes the bench. He likes watching the road. He likes the slow pace of small-town afternoons when nothing particular is happening and nothing particular needs to happen. This is Hadley in the early summer of 1971. A small town, a quiet town, a town where the biggest excitement of any given week is usually the Wednesday night church supper, or the Friday night high school baseball game, or the occasional thunderstorm that knocks out the power for a few hours and gives everyone something new to talk about at Mabel's the next morning. But something is about to happen to Hadley in the summer of 1971. Something that nobody in the town is expecting. Something that will arrive slowly, quietly, one engine at a time, and that will, over the course of a single summer, transform the character of the town in ways that nobody could have predicted. The first motorcycle arrives on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of June. Roy Tanner is the first person in Hadley to see it. He is sitting on his bench in front of the gas station, drinking coffee, watching the road, when he hears it, a sound from the south, a low rumble, barely audible at first, growing slowly the way distant thunder grows. Roy sets his coffee cup on the bench beside him. He tilts his head slightly. He listens. The rumble gets louder. It is not a car. It is not a truck. It is a motorcycle. Roy can tell by the rhythm of the engine, the particular uneven throbbing of a big V-twin, different from the smooth hum of a car engine or the deep diesel growl of a truck. Roy has not heard many motorcycles in Hadley. Motorcycles are not common in this part of the Ozarks. Most people drive trucks. A few people drive cars. Nobody in Hadley owns a motorcycle. The motorcycle comes around the curve at the south end of town and rolls slowly up the main street. It is a Harley-Davidson, a shovelhead, dark red, almost maroon, with chrome pipes and a wide handlebar and leather saddlebags. The rider is a man in his late 30s wearing a leather vest over a denim shirt with a red bandana around his head and round sunglasses. He's riding slowly, looking at the town the way a person looks at a place they have never been to before, with curiosity, with interest, with the particular attention of someone who is deciding whether this place is worth stopping in. The motorcycle rolls past the hardware store, past the barber shop, past Mabel's diner where Mabel is standing in the front window, watching the motorcycle pass with her hands on her hips and her eyebrows raised. Past the post office, past the park with the gazebo, past the war memorial, all the way down the main street to Roy's gas station at the south end. The rider pulls up to the pumps. He shuts off the engine. The sudden silence is enormous. The shovelhead's rumble has been filling the entire main street for the last 30 seconds, echoing off the brick and wooden buildings, and now it is gone, replaced by the ordinary sounds of Hadley, the cicadas, the distant bark of a dog, the soft hum of Roy's coffee maker inside the office. The rider takes off his sunglasses. He looks at Roy, who is sitting on his bench, coffee cup in hand, looking at the motorcycle with the calm, unhurried curiosity of a man who has seen a lot of engines in his life, but hasn't seen many shovelheads. "Afternoon," the rider says. "Afternoon," Roy says. "Can I get some gas?" "That's what we're here for." Roy stands up. He walks to the pump. He picks up the nozzle. The rider unscrews the gas cap on the shovelhead's tank. Roy begins to fill it. The numbers on the pump turn slowly. "Where you headed?" Roy asks. "Nowhere particular," the rider says. "Just riding. Came down from Kansas City, looking for quiet roads." Roy nods. He understands this. He does not ride motorcycles, but he understands the desire for quiet roads. Quiet roads are one of the things Hadley has plenty of. "You found some," Roy says. The rider looks up the main street. He looks at the small buildings and the old houses and the park and the creek and the low forested ridges rising on both sides of the valley. He takes a slow breath of the warm Ozark air, an air that smells like pine and creek water and warm asphalt and the faint sweetness of honeysuckle growing along the fences. "This is a nice town," the rider says. "It is," Roy says. "Quiet. Quiet is what I was looking for." Roy finishes filling the tank. The total is $2.17. The rider pays. He thanks Roy. He puts on his sunglasses. He starts the shovelhead. The deep rumble fills the gas station again. The rider pulls away from the pump and rolls slowly back up the main street, past the post office, past Mabel's, past the hardware store. At the north end of town, instead of continuing north, he turns into the small gravel parking lot of a place that Roy had almost forgotten existed, a small motel called the Pine Ridge Motor Court, set back from the road behind a row of old cedar trees, with 6 small cabins and a hand-painted sign that has been there since the 1940s. The rider parks the shovelhead in front of cabin number 3. He shuts off the engine. He gets off the bike. He walks to the office. Roy watches from his bench at the other end of town. He cannot see the rider anymore. The cedar trees block the view. But he can hear the silence that follows the engine shutting off. The silence of a motorcycle that has arrived somewhere and is staying. Roy picks up his coffee cup. He takes a sip. He looks at the road. "Well," he says to nobody in particular, "that's something new." The rider's name was Frank Kessler. He was 38 years old. He was from Kansas City, where he worked as a welder at a shipyard on the Missouri River. He had been riding motorcycles since he was 20. He was not part of a club. He was not part of a gang. He was just a man who liked to ride, who had 2 weeks of vacation saved up, and who had decided to spend those 2 weeks riding south through the Ozark Hills, looking for quiet roads and quiet towns, and the particular kind of peace that only comes from being far away from everything you know on a motorcycle you trust. Frank stayed at the Pine Ridge Motor Court for 3 nights. He paid $12 a night, which was more than the cabins were probably worth. They were old, with thin walls and small windows and mattresses that sagged in the middle. But Frank did not mind. The cabins were clean. The owner, an elderly woman named Dot, who had been running the motor court since her husband died in 1964, was kind and quiet and did not ask too many questions. And the location was perfect, at the edge of a small town, surrounded by cedar trees, with the sound of the creek audible through the cabin window at night. During his 3 days in Hadley, Frank did what riders do in small towns. He rode the back roads. He explored the hills. He found a small lake about 8 miles south of town, where he sat on a rock and watched the water for an hour, without seeing another person. He ate breakfast and lunch at Mabel's diner, where Mabel served him eggs and biscuits and coffee, and asked him where he was from and where he was going, and how long he had been riding, and whether his mother knew he was out on a motorcycle by himself. Frank answered all of her questions patiently because he understood that Mabel's questions were not intrusive. They were welcoming. They were her way of bringing a stranger into the fabric of the town, even temporarily. He bought gas from Roy twice. Both times Roy came out and pumped the gas and checked the oil, and they talked briefly about the shovel head, about the engine, about the mileage, about the particular sound the exhaust made at low RPMs. Roy was interested in the motorcycle the way Roy was interested in all engines, with the calm, professional curiosity of a man who understood machinery at a fundamental level. Frank appreciated this. Most people looked at his motorcycle and saw rebellion or danger or midlife crisis. Roy looked at his motorcycle and saw an engine. Frank liked Roy. On his last morning in Hadley, Frank sat at the counter at Mabel's and ate his eggs and drank his coffee and told Mabel he was leaving. "Heading home?" Mabel asked. "Heading further south first, then home." "Well, you come back anytime. We don't get many motorcycle folks through here, but the ones we get are usually good people." Frank smiled. He paid his bill. He tipped well. He walked out to the shovel head, which was parked at the curb in front of the diner. He started the engine. The deep rumble filled the main street one more time. A few people on the sidewalk looked up. Mabel watched from the front window. Roy watched from his bench at the gas station. Frank raised one hand in a slow wave, to nobody in particular, to everybody in general, and rode slowly down the main street and out of town. That was the first week of June. Frank Kessler was the first motorcycle rider to visit Hadley in a long time. He was not the last. About 10 days after Frank left, 2 more motorcycles arrived. They came from the north, on the same road Frank had come from, rolling slowly into town at about 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. 2 Harley-Davidsons Sportsters, one black and one dark green, ridden by 2 men in their early 40s who looked like they had been on the road for a few days. Dusty jackets, sunburned faces, saddlebags packed full. They pulled into Roy's gas station. Roy pumped their gas. They asked if there was a place to stay. Roy told them about the Pine Ridge Motor Court. They asked if there was a place to eat. Roy told them about Mabel's. They thanked him and rode up to the motor court and checked in. That evening, the 2 riders ate dinner at Mabel's. They sat in a booth by the window. They ordered burgers and fries and coffee. They were quiet, not unfriendly, just tired from the road, the way riders are tired after a long day. Mabel served them with her usual warmth. She asked where they were from. St. Louis, they said. She asked where they were going. Just riding, they said, looking for good roads. You found them, Mabel said. The same thing Roy had said to Frank. Because it was true. The roads around Hadley were some of the best riding roads in the Ozarks. Narrow, winding, rolling through the forested hills with long sweeping curves and almost no traffic. The kind of roads that motorcycle riders dream about. The 2 St. Louis riders stayed for 4 days. They rode the back roads during the day and ate at Mabel's in the evenings and drank beer at the small bar that operated out of the back room of the VFW hall on Saturday night. They were friendly. They talked to people. They complimented the town. They tipped well. When they left, Mabel said, "Come back anytime." And she meant it, and they said they would. And they meant it too. A week later, 3 more motorcycles arrived. Then, a few days after that, 2 more. Then 4 more. Then, on a Saturday at the end of June, 7 motorcycles arrived at once. A small group of friends from Springfield, riding together, who had heard about Hadley from someone who had heard about it from someone who had heard about it from Frank Kessler, who had apparently told a few people back in Kansas City about the quiet little town in the Ozarks with the good roads and the good diner and the kind gas station man who actually knew something about engines. The word was spreading, not through advertising, not through newspapers or magazines or radio, through the oldest and most reliable form of communication in the motorcycle world, word of mouth. One rider tells another rider about a good road. That rider tells 2 more riders. Those 2 riders tell 4 more. The network expands geometrically, quietly, without anyone organizing it or even being aware that it is happening. The riders just talk to each other, at gas stations, at diners, at rallies, at bike nights, and the name of a good place gets passed from one conversation to the next, like a small secret that everyone is happy to share. By the first week of July, Hadley had more motorcycles parked on its main street on any given afternoon than it had cars. This was not an exaggeration. The numbers told the story. Hadley had about 160 cars and trucks registered to residents of the town. On a typical summer afternoon before the motorcycles started coming, maybe 15 or 20 of those vehicles would be parked along the main street at any given time. Now, on a typical summer afternoon in early July, there were 25 or 30 motorcycles parked along the main street, plus the usual 15 or 20 cars and trucks. The motorcycles outnumbered the cars on most days, and on weekends when the riders from Springfield and St. Louis and Kansas City came down in larger groups, the motorcycles outnumbered the cars by 2 or 3 to 1. The people of Hadley noticed. Of course they noticed. You cannot go from seeing 1 motorcycle a month to seeing 30 motorcycles a day without noticing. The question was not whether they noticed, but how they felt about what they noticed. The answer, like most answers in small towns, was complicated. Some people were pleased. The owner of the grocery store, a man named Carl, was pleased because the riders bought water and snacks and sunscreen, and the occasional 6-pack of beer. Dot at the Pine Ridge Motor Court was pleased because her cabins, which had been mostly empty for years, were now fully booked most weekends. Roy at the gas station was pleased because he was pumping more gas in a week than he used to pump in a month. And Mabel was pleased because her diner, which had been slowly declining for years as the town's population aged and shrank, was suddenly full again. Full of new faces, new conversations, new tips, new energy. The motorcycle riders were bringing money to Hadley. Not a lot of money, but enough to matter. Enough to keep a few small businesses alive that might otherwise have closed. Other people were less pleased. Not hostile, not angry, just uneasy. The kind of uneasiness that small towns feel when something unfamiliar arrives and begins to change the character of the place. The motorcycles were loud. Not dangerously loud, not law-breakingly loud, but loud enough to be heard from one end of the main street to the other when a group of Harleys rolled through town at 4 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon. The sound was new. Hadley was not accustomed to new sounds. The sound of the cicadas was familiar. The sound of the church bells was familiar. The sound of Roy's air compressor in the repair bay was familiar. The sound of 30 Harley-Davidsons rumbling down Main Street wasn't familiar. And unfamiliarity in a town that valued sameness was unsettling. There were small frictions. A few of the older residents complained about the noise at the Wednesday night town council meeting. A few mothers expressed concern about the safety of children riding bicycles on a main street that was now shared with large, heavy motorcycles. A few of the more conservative church members worried, in the vague, non-specific way that conservative church members worry about things, that the motorcycle riders would bring a bad element to the town. Drugs, violence, immorality, the kinds of things that motorcycle riders were associated with in movies and on television, even though the riders who were actually coming to Hadley were, for the most part, middle-aged working men who held steady jobs and paid their taxes and were about as dangerous as a basket of kittens. The town council discussed the matter. The discussion was polite and inconclusive, the way town council discussions in small Missouri towns usually are. Some council members thought the motorcycles were good for business. Some thought they were bad for the peace and quiet. The mayor, a retired schoolteacher named Harold Clemens, who had been mayor for 11 years and who had the particular talent of saying nothing at great length, suggested that they wait and see how the summer developed before taking any action. The council agreed. They would wait and see. Mabel, who wasn't on the town council, but who attended every meeting because Mabel attended everything, stood up at the end of the discussion and said something that the whole town would remember for a long time afterward. "These people are coming to our town because they like it here," Mabel said. "They're not coming to cause trouble. They're coming because somebody told them we have good roads and good food and good people. And if we start treating them like they're a problem, they'll stop coming. And when they stop coming, we'll go back to being a town that nobody has ever heard of and that nobody ever comes to. And I don't know about the rest of you, but I've had enough of being a town that nobody comes to." The room was quiet after Mabel spoke. A few people nodded. A few people looked at the floor. Harold Clemens cleared his throat and said, "Well, I think that about covers it," and the meeting was adjourned. The motorcycles kept coming. Through the first 2 weeks of July, the steady stream of riders continued. Most of them stayed for a day or two. Some stayed for a week. A few stayed longer. The Pine Ridge Motor Court was full every weekend and most weeknights. Dot, who had been thinking about closing the motor court for the last few years because the business was too slow to justify keeping it open, was now turning people away on Friday nights because all 6 cabins were booked. The riders came from everywhere: Kansas City, St. Louis, Springfield, Tulsa, Memphis, Little Rock, a few from as far away as Chicago and Dallas. They came alone and in pairs and in small groups. They came on Harleys mostly, shovelheads and Sportsters and Electra Glides and a few older panheads, but also on a few Hondas and a couple of Triumphs and one ancient Indian that drew admiring looks from every other rider in town. They were, as Mabel had said, good people. They were polite. They were friendly. They tipped well. They did not cause trouble. They did not get into fights. They did not ride recklessly through the residential streets. They parked their motorcycles neatly along the curb on Main Street in orderly rows, the way experienced riders park, angled toward the curb, kickstands down, spaced evenly, each bike leaving enough room for the next one. The row of parked Harleys along Main Street became, over the weeks of July, one of the most striking visual features of the town. A long line of chrome and leather and dark paint, gleaming in the summer sun, stretching from the hardware store to the post office. People began to come from nearby towns just to see the motorcycles. Not to ride, just to look. Families from the neighboring towns would drive to Hadley on Saturday afternoons and park their cars on the side streets and walk up and down Main Street, looking at the parked motorcycles the way people look at cars at a car show. Children would point and ask questions. Old men would lean on their canes and study the engines with the particular focused attention of men who had grown up around machinery and who appreciated good machinery even when it came in an unfamiliar form. Women would comment on the paint colors and the chrome and the leather seats, finding beauty in the motorcycles the same way they might find beauty in a well-made quilt or a well-tended garden. The town was changing, slowly, quietly, the way towns change when something new arrives, and the people decide consciously or unconsciously to accept it. Hadley was becoming known in the small, informal networks of Ozark motorcycle culture as a good place, a welcoming place, a place where a rider could stop and eat and rest and be treated with courtesy and kindness, a place where the roads were beautiful and the people were decent, and the diner served the best biscuits and gravy in the southern Missouri hills. And all of this, all of the riders, all of the motorcycles, all of the business, all of the change could be traced back to a single rider on a single Tuesday afternoon in the second week of June. A welder from Kansas City named Frank Kessler, who had been looking for quiet roads and had found them, and who had told a few friends about a small town in the Ozarks that was worth visiting, and whose recommendation had rippled outward through the motorcycle community, like a stone dropped into still water, one ring at a time, until the rings reached every corner of the region and the motorcycles came pouring in. Frank Kessler had no idea what he had started. He was back in Kansas City, back at the shipyard, welding joints on river barges, completely unaware that the quiet little town he had visited for 3 days had become the most popular motorcycle destination in the southern Missouri Ozarks. He would not find out until later in the summer, when he rode back down to Hadley for a second visit and discovered that the town he had found quiet and empty was now full of motorcycles, and the diner had a line out the door on Saturday mornings. But that is later in the story. For now, in the first weeks of July 1971, the transformation of Hadley is still in its early stages. The motorcycles are coming. The town is adjusting. Mabel is pouring coffee for new faces. Roy is pumping gas for new engines. Dot is washing sheets for new guests. And the quiet little valley town in the Ozark Hills is becoming, for one strange and beautiful summer, the kind of place that people talk about for a long time afterward. The kind of place where something unexpected happened. The kind of place where the unexpected turned out to be good. By the middle of July, the transformation of Hadley was complete. Not physically. The town still looked the same old buildings and the same old houses and the same old trees. But atmospherically, the feeling of the town had changed. The rhythm of the town had changed. The sounds and the smells and the daily patterns of the town had changed. Hadley was still Hadley, but Hadley was also something else now. Something it had never been before. A destination. A place that people came to on purpose, instead of a place that people passed through by accident. The most visible sign of the change was on Main Street itself. On any given afternoon in the middle of July, the south side of Main Street was lined with motorcycles, 30 of them, 40 of them. Sometimes on the busiest Saturdays, 50 or more. They were parked in a long gleaming row, nose to the curb, chrome catching the afternoon sun, leather seats warm from the heat, engines ticking softly as they cooled. The row stretched from the hardware store all the way to the post office, and sometimes around the corner and down the side street toward the church. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary sight for a town of 400 people. More motorcycles than cars, more chrome than paint, more leather than cotton. The main street of a quiet Ozark town looked like the parking lot of a Sturgis rally, scaled down to a size that was somehow more beautiful for being smaller. The sound of the town had changed too. Before the motorcycles, the loudest regular sound in Hadley was the church bell on Sunday morning, which rang 7 times at 10 o'clock and could be heard from one end of the valley to the other. Now the loudest regular sound was the rumble of Harley-Davidsons arriving and departing, rolling slowly through town with their deep, uneven idle, their exhaust notes bouncing off the old brick and wooden buildings and carrying out over the rooftops and into the forested hills beyond. The rumble was constant during the daylight hours, not overwhelming, not aggressive, just present. A deep background vibration that had become, within the space of a few weeks, part of the texture of the town. The smell of the town had changed too. Before the motorcycles, Hadley smelled like every small Ozark town in summer. Pine trees, creek water, warm asphalt, honeysuckle, and whatever Mabel was cooking at the diner. Now, mixed in with those familiar smells, there were new ones. Exhaust fumes, not heavy, not choking, just a faint trace of combusted gasoline in the air. The particular sweet, sharp smell that Harley-Davidsons leave behind them like a signature. Leather, the warm, rich smell of heated leather seats and saddlebags and jackets, baking in the July sun. Chrome polish, the faint chemical sweetness of metal polish that a few of the riders used on their bikes in the motor court parking lot in the evenings. These new smells mixed with the old smells and created something that was neither new nor old, but both at once, the smell of a town in the middle of becoming something it had not planned to become. Mabel's diner was the epicenter of the transformation. Before the motorcycles, Mabel served about 40 customers a day. Mostly regulars, mostly locals, mostly the same faces sitting in the same seats, ordering the same food. Now, Mabel's was serving 80 customers a day, sometimes 100. The regulars were still there. They still sat at the counter. They still ordered the same breakfast. They still talked about the weather and the creek and the price of cattle. But they were now surrounded by new faces. Riders from Kansas City and St. Louis and Springfield and Tulsa, sitting in the booths, eating burgers and drinking coffee, talking about roads and engines and the particular feeling of riding through the Ozark hills on a hot July afternoon. The regulars and the riders coexisted with a surprising ease. There were no confrontations, no arguments, no territorial disputes over seating or service. The regulars accepted the riders the way they accepted the weather, as a fact of the current season that was beyond their control, and that was not, upon closer inspection, entirely unwelcome. The riders, for their part, respected the regulars. They didn't take the regular seats at the counter. They did not talk too loudly. They did not complain about the food or the service or the speed of the coffee. They understood instinctively that they were guests in someone else's town, and they behaved accordingly. Mabel was the bridge between the two groups. She moved along the counter and through the booths with the ease of a diplomat, speaking the language of both communities fluently. To the regulars, she was the same Mabel she had always been, sharp-tongued, warm-hearted, full of opinions about everything, pouring coffee with one hand and delivering unsolicited advice with the other. To the riders, she was something slightly different, a hostess, a welcomer, a woman who made every stranger feel like they had been coming to her diner for years. She remembered names. She remembered orders. She remembered details. You're the one from Tulsa who likes his eggs scrambled dry. Or, you're the one from Kansas City who takes cream but no sugar. And the riders loved her for it. They left big tips. They told her the food was wonderful. They asked if they could take photographs of the diner. Mabel said yes to the photographs, but no to the compliments, because Mabel was the kind of woman who deflected compliments the way a shield deflects arrows, automatically, reflexively, without thinking about it. Linda, Mabel's daughter, was working harder than she had ever worked in her life. The kitchen, which was designed for 40 customers a day, was now producing food for twice that number. Linda was up at 4:30 every morning, making biscuit dough, cutting bacon, cracking eggs, peeling potatoes for hash browns. She had hired a helper, a teenage girl from the neighborhood named Jenny, who was 17 and who had never worked in a kitchen before, but who learned fast and who could scramble eggs and flip pancakes with a competence that surprised everyone, including herself. The kitchen was hot. The kitchen was loud. The kitchen was the hardest working room in Hadley, Missouri, in the summer of 1971. Roy's gas station was the second epicenter. Roy was pumping more gas than he had pumped in years. His 2 pumps were in constant use during the peak hours, from about 10 in the morning, when the first riders headed out for their day rides, to about 6 in the evening when the last riders came back and topped off their tanks before parking for the night. Roy loved it. He loved the engines. He loved talking to the riders about their motorcycles, about the carburetors and the ignition timing and the particular quirks of different shovelhead models. He loved the variety. After 15 years of working mostly on pickup trucks and tractors, Roy was suddenly surrounded by beautiful, hand-built machines that he had only seen in magazines. He also became, without planning it, the unofficial mechanic of the motorcycle community in Hadley. Riders who had small problems, a loose chain, a slipping clutch, a sputtering carburetor, would bring their bikes to Roy, and Roy would look at the problem with his calm professional eye and fix it, usually within a few hours, usually for a price that the riders found astonishingly low compared to what they paid at motorcycle shops in the city. Roy did not charge low prices out of charity. He charged low prices because Hadley was a low-price town. Everything in Hadley was cheap. The gas was cheap. The food was cheap. The motel rooms were cheap. The labor was cheap. The town operated on a different economic scale than the cities the riders came from. And the riders, who were accustomed to paying $60 for a carburetor adjustment in Kansas City, were delighted to find that Roy would do the same adjustment for $20 and throw in a free cup of his terrible coffee. The Pine Ridge Motor Court was full every night. Dot was overwhelmed. She was 71 years old. She had been running the motor court alone since her husband died 7 years ago. She had been planning to close it. She had been thinking about selling the property to a developer who wanted to build a small storage facility on the lot. But now the cabins were full and the money was coming in. And Dot was busier than she had been in decades. She hired help. A young man from town named Bobby, who was 19, and who had just graduated from high school and was not sure what he wanted to do with his life, started working at the motor court 3 days a week. Bobby changed sheets. Bobby cleaned bathrooms. Bobby swept the small gravel parking lot. Bobby, who had never had much contact with the motorcycle riders before, found himself fascinated by the machines and the people who rode them. He asked questions. The riders answered. Within a few weeks, Bobby knew more about Harley-Davidson shovelheads than most motorcycle mechanics, simply from spending time around the riders and listening to their conversations. The town began to adapt in small practical ways. The grocery store, which had never stocked much beyond the basics, began to carry a few items that the riders seemed to want. Bottled water in larger quantities, sunscreen, granola bars, the particular brand of beef jerky that riders seemed to prefer. The hardware store put a small display of motorcycle-related items near the front door. A few cans of chrome polish, some WD-40, a couple of basic toolkits. The barber shop, which had been cutting the same conservative haircuts for the same conservative customers for 30 years, found itself occasionally visited by a rider who wanted a trim, and the barber, a quiet man named Louis, cut their hair without comment, because hair is hair, and a customer is a customer. The children of Hadley adapted fastest. Children always adapt fastest. Within the first 2 weeks of July, the children of Hadley had gone from staring at the motorcycles with wide-eyed amazement to treating them as a normal part of the landscape. They walked past the long row of parked Harleys on Main Street the way they walked past the parked cars, with casual familiarity. A few of the bolder children asked the riders questions. How fast does it go? Can I sit on it? Is that a real Harley? The riders were almost always patient and friendly with the children. A few of them let the smaller children sit on their bikes, with parental permission, of course. And the sight of a 6-year-old sitting on a Harley-Davidson shovelhead, with a grin the size of Texas, became one of the regular small delights of a Hadley summer afternoon. The older residents adapted more slowly, as older residents do. A few of them never quite got used to the noise. A few of them never quite accepted the presence of strangers in their town, But most of them, over the weeks of July, came around. They came around because the riders were respectful. They came around because the riders spent money at local businesses. They came around because the riders, for all their leather and chrome and loud engines, turned out to be ordinary people. Men with jobs and families and mortgages and sore backs, and the same basic desire for a cold beer and a good meal at the end of a long hot day that every person in Hadley shared. The coexistence was not perfect. It was never perfect. There were small irritations. A rider who revved his engine too loudly at 7 in the morning. A group of riders who stayed too late at the VFW bar on a Saturday night and were a little too loud walking back to the motor court. A rider who parked his motorcycle in front of someone's driveway and had to be asked to move it. Small things. The kind of small frictions that happen whenever two groups of people share a space that was designed for one group. But the frictions were small, and they were handled quietly, the way small frictions are handled in small towns. With a conversation, a handshake, a quiet word from Mabel or Roy, or one of the other respected members of the community. Nobody called the police. Nobody wrote angry letters. Nobody organized a petition. The frictions were absorbed by the town the way the town absorbed the heat of the summer, patiently, without complaint, as part of the natural cost of living in a place where things sometimes got a little uncomfortable. And the benefits for most people outweighed the costs. The money was flowing. The businesses were thriving. The town was alive in a way it had not been alive in years. Hadley, which had been slowly fading for decades, losing population, losing businesses, losing the particular energy that comes from being a place where things happen, was suddenly a place where things were happening. Not big things, not dramatic things, just the small, steady things that make a town feel alive. New faces, new conversations, new stories. The sound of laughter coming from Mabel's diner at 8 o'clock on a Saturday morning. The sight of 30 motorcycles gleaming in the sun on Main Street. The smell of burgers on the grill at 6 o'clock on a Friday evening. The summer was reaching its peak. The heat was at its maximum. The cicadas were at their loudest. The days were at their longest. The motorcycles were at their most numerous. Everything was at its fullest, the way everything in nature is at its fullest. In the middle of July, the trees, the fields, the creek, the sky, the long, slow afternoons that seemed to stretch out forever before finally surrendering to the warm, heavy evenings. And Hadley, the small, quiet town in the Ozark hills that most people had never heard of, was having the most remarkable summer of its long, quiet existence. A summer when the motorcycles outnumbered the cars. A summer when the diner was full every morning and the gas station was busy every afternoon and the motor court was booked every night. A summer when a town of 400 people became, for a brief and beautiful and entirely accidental moment, one of the most popular motorcycle destinations in the Ozark Hills. Nobody planned it. Nobody organized it. Nobody advertised it. It just happened. The way the best things in life just happen. Quietly, naturally. One rider at a time. One conversation at a time. One cup of coffee at a time. The summer of 1971. The summer of the motorcycles. The summer when a small town had more Harleys than cars. It was, by any measure, a good summer. The best summer Hadley had had in a very long time. But summers end. All summers end. And this one was about to. The last Saturday of July was the biggest day Hadley had ever seen. Nobody planned it that way. Nobody organized a rally or an event or a gathering. It was not advertised in any magazine or newspaper or on any radio station. It just happened. The way everything that summer just happened, organically, naturally. One rider telling another rider who told another rider. who told 3 more, and all of them deciding independently to ride to Hadley on the same Saturday at the end of July, because the weather was good and the roads were calling, and someone had told them about a small town in the Ozarks that was worth visiting. Roy saw them first. He was sitting on his bench at 6:45 in the morning, drinking his first cup of coffee, watching the road the way he watched the road every morning. The sun was already up. The air was already warm. The cicadas were already singing. It was going to be another hot day. The first group arrived at about 7 o'clock. 4 motorcycles riding in a loose, staggered formation coming from the north. They rolled slowly down Main Street, their engines rumbling in unison, and pulled into Roy's gas station. Roy pumped their gas. They were from Joplin, about 90 miles to the west. They had left before dawn. The second group arrived at about 7:30. 6 motorcycles from Springfield. They parked along the curb in front of Mabel's and went inside for breakfast. The third group arrived at 8. 5 motorcycles from Tulsa. The fourth group arrived at 8:15. 3 motorcycles from Little Rock. The fifth group arrived at 8:30. 7 motorcycles from Kansas City. And they kept coming. By 9 o'clock, there were more than 30 motorcycles parked along Main Street. By 10 o'clock, there were more than 50. By 11 o'clock, there were more than 70. By noon, when the sun was directly overhead, and the heat was at its most brutal, and the asphalt of Main Street was so hot that you could see the air shimmering above it like water, there were more than 90 motorcycles parked in Hadley. 90 motorcycles. In a town of 400 people. In a town that had 160 registered cars and trucks. The motorcycles outnumbered the cars by more than 2 to 1. The main street was not just lined with motorcycles. It was overwhelmed with motorcycles. They were parked on both sides of the street. They were parked on the side streets. They were parked in the parking lot behind the hardware store. They were parked in the gravel lot next to the church. They were parked in Dot's motor court parking lot, and along the driveway of the motor court, and along the road in front of the motor court. There were motorcycles everywhere. The riders were everywhere too, walking up and down Main Street, sitting on the benches in the park, standing in small groups on the sidewalks, talking, laughing, looking at each other's bikes, comparing engines and paint jobs and modifications, eating at Mabel's, which had a line out the door that stretched halfway down the block, the longest line Mabel had ever seen in 18 years of running the diner. Buying gas at Roy's, where the 2 pumps had a constant queue of 3 or 4 bikes each, and Roy was pumping gas as fast as the pumps would allow, which was not very fast, because the pumps were old and the gasoline flowed at the leisurely pace of 1950s technology. Mabel was in her element. She was moving through the diner with a speed and an energy that belied her 68 years and her aching feet. She was pouring coffee with both hands. She was calling orders back to Linda in the kitchen with a voice that could cut through the noise of 90 Harley-Davidsons. She was greeting every customer by name if she knew their name, and by honey or sweetheart if she didn't. She was making jokes. She was giving directions. She was telling people where the bathroom was and where the creek was and where the best roads were and where they could park their motorcycles without blocking anyone's driveway. Linda was in the kitchen working at a pace she had never worked at before. Jenny, the teenage helper, was beside her, scrambling eggs and flipping pancakes and buttering toast with the focused intensity of a young person who has discovered, under pressure, that she is capable of much more than she thought she was. The grill was covered with food. The coffee maker was running nonstop. The dishwasher was cycling every 20 minutes. The kitchen was 120 degrees. Linda's hair was plastered to her forehead with sweat. Jenny's apron was covered in grease and flour and egg yolk. Neither of them complained. Neither of them slowed down. They worked through the morning and into the afternoon without a break because the customers kept coming and the food kept being ordered, and there was no time to stop. Roy was having the best business day of his life. He had pumped more gas by noon than he usually pumped in a week. His 2 old pumps were working continuously, their mechanical number wheels turning slowly as the gallons accumulated. Roy moved between the pumps with the calm, steady efficiency of a man who has been doing this work for 15 years and who can pump gas and carry on a conversation and check an oil level and wash a windshield all at the same time without breaking a sweat. He was sweating, of course. Everyone in Hadley was sweating on this particular Saturday in late July. But he was not breaking a sweat. There is a difference. The people of Hadley watched all of this with a mixture of amazement and amusement, and a small amount of anxiety. They had gotten used to the motorcycles over the last 6 weeks. But this was different. This was not 30 motorcycles on a regular afternoon. This was 90 motorcycles on a single day. This was more motorcycles than most people in Hadley had seen in their entire lives, concentrated on a single main street in a single small town on a single hot Saturday at the end of July. Harold Clemens, the mayor, walked up and down Main Street at about 11 o'clock, looking at the motorcycles, looking at the riders, looking at the crowds, looking at everything with the particular expression of a man who is trying to decide whether what he is seeing is wonderful or terrible, and who is not yet sure which conclusion he's going to arrive at. He stopped at Mabel's. He did not go inside. The line was too long. He stood on the sidewalk outside the front window and looked at the crowd inside. Every stool at the counter was taken. Every booth was full. People were standing near the door, waiting for a seat. The noise inside was the noise of 100 conversations happening at once. The bright, cheerful chaos of a restaurant that is operating at 3 times its intended capacity. Harold walked to Roy's gas station. Roy was pumping gas. Harold stood beside the bench and watched for a few minutes. "You okay, Roy?" Harold asked. "Never better," Roy said. He was smiling, a real smile, the smile of a man who is doing the thing he loves at the level he has always wanted to do it. "This is a lot of motorcycles," Harold said. "It is." "You think there's going to be any trouble?" Roy looked up the street. 90 motorcycles. 200 riders, give or take. Men and women mostly in their 30s and 40s and 50s. Leather jackets and denim vests and sunglasses and bandanas. They looked like a motorcycle rally. They looked like a Harley-Davidson advertisement. They looked, if you didn't know better, like the kind of crowd that small-town mayors are supposed to worry about. But Roy knew better. Roy had been talking to these riders for 6 weeks. He knew their names. He knew their hometowns. He knew what they did for a living. He knew that the big man on the black shovelhead was a high school football coach from Tulsa. He knew that the woman on the red Sportster was a nurse from Springfield. He knew that the older couple on the matching Electra Glides were retired teachers from St. Louis who had been married for 41 years. He knew that these were not outlaws. These were not rebels. These were ordinary people on extraordinary machines, spending a Saturday in a small town because someone had told them it was a good place to be. "No trouble," Roy said. "These are good people, Harold." Harold nodded. He stood beside the bench for a few more minutes, watching the motorcycles, watching the riders, watching his town be something he had never seen it be before. Then he walked back up the street to Mabel's. The line was shorter now. He went inside. He sat at the counter. Mabel poured him a cup of coffee. "Well," Mabel said, "what do you think?" Harold looked around the diner. Every seat was full. The noise was cheerful. The food was good. The tips were generous. The cash register was ringing more than it had rung on any single day since Mabel opened the diner 18 years ago. "I think," Harold said slowly, "that this is the most interesting day this town has had in a very long time." Mabel smiled, a big smile. The biggest smile Harold had seen on Mabel's face in years. "It sure is," she said, and she poured him a fresh cup of coffee and went back to work. The afternoon was even busier than the morning. The riders who had eaten breakfast and ridden the back roads all morning came back into town for lunch and for gas and for cold drinks and for the simple pleasure of being in a place where they were welcome. The main street was a slow-moving parade of chrome and leather and deep engine rumble. Riders walked their bikes up and down the street, looking at each other's machines, stopping to talk, stopping to admire, stopping to share the particular easy camaraderie that motorcycle riders share with each other when they are in a place they love. A few of the Hadley residents set up folding chairs on the sidewalk in front of their houses and sat and watched the parade, the way people sit and watch parades on the 4th of July. A few of them brought out coolers of lemonade and offered cups to the riders who walked past. A few of the children set up a small stand on the sidewalk near the park and sold lemonade for $0.10 a cup. And they sold out within an hour and had to make more, and then sold out again. The entrepreneurial spirit of Hadley's youngest citizens was fully engaged, and the riders, who were thirsty and amused and happy to support a kid's lemonade stand, bought every cup. Late in the afternoon, something happened that nobody planned and that nobody expected. It was the kind of moment that only occurs when a large group of people are in the same place at the same time. And the chemistry of the crowd produces something spontaneous and beautiful. At about 5 o'clock, when the heat was beginning to ease slightly and the shadows were beginning to lengthen, a rider named Pete, a big quiet man from Kansas City who was sitting on his motorcycle near the park, pulled out a harmonica and began to play. He played slowly, a blues melody, nothing fancy, just a simple, slow 12-bar blues, the kind that a man plays when he is sitting on a motorcycle on a warm evening in a small town, and the world feels right. Another rider, a man from Springfield who had a small acoustic guitar strapped to the back of his bike, heard the harmonica. He walked over. He sat down on the bench near Pete. He began to play along, softly, just chord behind the harmonica melody, a simple accompaniment. Two strangers playing music together for the first time, without rehearsal, without discussion, without anything except the shared instinct that musicians have when they hear music and want to be part of it. A third rider joined, then a fourth. Someone had a small hand drum, someone else had a tambourine. Within 15 minutes, there was a small impromptu band playing in the park, and the music was drifting across Main Street and into the open windows of the houses and the open door of Mabel's diner. And people were starting to gather around the park to listen. The music was not professional. It was not polished. It was not the kind of music you would pay to hear in a concert hall. It was the kind of music that happens when ordinary people with ordinary skills play together in an ordinary place, on an extraordinary evening. It was rough and simple and honest and beautiful. The way all the best things in Hadley that summer were rough and simple and honest and beautiful. Mabel came out of the diner. She stood on the sidewalk and listened. Linda came out of the kitchen and stood beside her mother. Jenny came out too. Roy walked up from the gas station. Dot walked over from the motor court. Harold came out of his house. Mrs. Patterson from the church came out. Mr. and Mrs. Henderson from the house on the corner came out. The children who had been selling lemonade came over with their empty pitcher. Slowly, gradually, the entire population of Hadley, the 400 permanent residents, and the 200 temporary motorcycle visitors gathered in and around the small park at the center of town, and they listened to the music, and they talked softly to each other, and they drank lemonade and beer and water, and they watched the sun go down behind the western ridge. The sunset that evening was spectacular. The Ozark sky turned from blue to gold to orange to a deep fiery red, and the clouds caught the color and held it, and the whole valley was bathed in a warm rose gold light that made everything, the old houses, the old buildings, the old trees, the motorcycles, the faces of the people, look like they had been painted by someone who wanted the world to be more beautiful than it already was. The music played on, the harmonica and the guitar and the small drum and the tambourine, playing a slow, easy blues in the fading light. A few people danced, not formally, not dramatically, just a few couples swaying gently in the warm evening air, holding each other loosely, moving to the slow rhythm. An old man and his wife, a young rider and his girlfriend, two children spinning in circles, laughing, dizzy, falling on the grass and getting up and spinning again. Mabel stood on the sidewalk and watched all of it. She had her arms crossed over her apron and her chin was slightly lifted, and her eyes were bright, and she was smiling the kind of smile that a person smiles when something they hope for has come true, and the reality of it is even better than the hope. This was the moment, the peak, the highest point of the summer of 1971 in Hadley, Missouri. The moment when the town and the riders came together completely, without reservation, without friction, without any of the uneasiness that had marked the early days. The moment when Hadley stopped being a town that had motorcycles in it and became a town that was part of the motorcycle community, not permanently, not formally, just for this one evening, just for this one sunset, just for this one slow blues played by strangers in a small park in a small town in the Ozark Hills. The music faded as the light faded. The harmonica player put his harmonica back in his vest pocket. The guitar player put his guitar back in its case. The small crowd began to drift apart, the riders heading to their bikes or to the motor court or to the VFW for a beer. The locals heading to their houses, the children being called home by their parents for baths and bedtime. The main street grew quieter. The engines started up one by one as some of the riders headed out, heading back to Kansas City or Springfield or wherever they were going, riding into the warm, dark night, their headlights cutting through the darkness, their engine sounds fading slowly into the distance. The town settled. The heat eased. The stars came out. The cicadas resumed their song, which they had paused, or seemed to have paused, during the music in the park. The creek made its soft, steady sound at the edge of town. The last light of the sunset faded from the western ridge. Roy sat on his bench at the gas station. His coffee cup was empty. His pumps were still. His day was done. He looked up the main street at the remaining motorcycles parked along the curb. Fewer now than at the peak, but still more than the cars. He looked at the stars. He listened to the cicadas. He felt the warm evening air on his face. "Well," he said to nobody in particular, the way he often said things to nobody in particular. That was something. It was. It was something. It was the biggest day in the history of Hadley, Missouri. A day when more motorcycles than cars filled the main street of a town of 400 people. A day when strangers played music in the park and the whole town came out to listen. A day when a small, quiet place in the Ozark Hills became, for a few hours, the center of a small, quiet universe of chrome and leather and warm summer air. Nobody wrote it down. Nobody took an official count. Nobody made a record of the day in any formal way. It existed only in the memories of the people who were there, the riders, the locals, the children, Mabel, Roy, Dot, Harold, Linda, Jenny, Pete with his harmonica, the man from Springfield with his guitar. Their memories would carry the day forward, the way memories carry everything forward, imperfectly, selectively, with certain details sharpened and certain details softened by the passage of time. But the day happened. It was real, and for the people who were there, it was unforgettable. August arrived the way August always arrives in the Ozarks, heavily, hotly, with the particular weight that the last full month of summer carries, when the heat has been going on for so long that the land and the people and the buildings all seem to sag slightly under the accumulation of it. The trees are darker green now, the deep, tired green of late summer, their leaves dusty and thick, having lost the bright, translucent quality of their spring emergence. The creek is lower than it was in June, the water moving more slowly over the stones, the crawdads harder to find because they have retreated deeper into the shade of the undercut banks. The cicadas are louder than ever, or seem louder because they have been singing for so long that the song has become a kind of pressure that builds inside the ears and inside the mind. The motorcycles were still coming, but the numbers had peaked. The last Saturday of July had been the high water mark. 90 motorcycles, the most Hadley would ever see in a single day. And now the tide was beginning to turn. Not dramatically, not suddenly. The way tides turn, gradually, imperceptibly, 1 inch at a time, until you look up and realize that the water is further from your feet than it was an hour ago. The first week of August, there were maybe 60 motorcycles on the busiest day. The second week, maybe 50. The third week, 40. The numbers were still remarkable for a town of 400 people. 40 motorcycles on Main Street was still more motorcycles than most small towns in Missouri saw in an entire year. But the direction was clear. The peak had passed. The summer was beginning to let go. The riders were leaving, not all at once, not in a dramatic exodus, one at a time, two at a time, a small group here, a solo rider there. The vacation weeks were ending. The jobs were calling. The families back home were expecting their fathers and husbands and brothers to return. The real world, the world of factories and offices and shipyards and classrooms, was reasserting its gravity, pulling the riders back from the small temporary paradise they had found in the Ozark Hills. Frank Kessler came back, the original rider, the welder from Kansas City who had started the whole thing by stopping at Roy's gas station on a Tuesday afternoon in June. He rode back to Hadley in the second week of August for a long weekend, and he was astonished by what he found. The town he had discovered quiet and nearly empty was now a motorcycle destination. The diner where he had eaten alone at the counter was now serving 100 customers a day. The motor court where he had slept in a cabin that felt like the loneliest room in America was now fully booked. Frank sat at the counter at Mabel's on a Friday morning and ate his eggs and drank his coffee and looked around at the crowded diner with an expression that was part amazement and part guilt and part pride. "I did this?" he said to Mabel. "You did this," Mabel said. "You told people about us." "I told 3 people, maybe 4. Well, they told 3 or 4 people, and those people told 3 or 4 more. And here we are." Frank shook his head slowly. He looked at his eggs. He looked at the riders in the booths. He looked at the long row of motorcycles visible through the front window. "I'm sorry," he said. "Sorry?" Mabel looked at him with the particular expression she reserved for people who said things she considered foolish. "Honey, you saved this town. Don't you dare apologize." Frank looked at her. He was not sure he believed her. He was not sure a town could be saved by motorcycles. But he could see the evidence. The diner was full. The cash register was ringing. The people behind the counter were busy and sweating and alive. The town outside the window was more active than it had probably been in decades. Something had happened to Hadley, and Frank was the person who had set it in motion. And whether it was salvation or disruption or something in between, it was real and it was here. And it was not going away anytime soon. Frank stayed for 3 days. He rode the back roads. He pumped gas at Roy's. He drank beer at the VFW on Saturday night. He slept in cabin number 3 at the Pine Ridge Motor Court, the same cabin he had stayed in the first time. He left on Monday morning early, before the town was fully awake. He did not say a big goodbye. He just started the shovelhead, rolled slowly down Main Street one more time, raised one hand in a slow wave to nobody in particular and everybody in general, and rode away. Mabel was watching from the front window. She waved back, even though Frank probably couldn't see her through the glass. The last 2 weeks of August were quieter. The motorcycle traffic dropped from 40 to 30 to 22 by the last weekend of August, about 15. The town was returning to its normal state. The long row of motorcycles on Main Street grew shorter each day. The line at Mabel's disappeared. Roy's pumps were idle for longer stretches. Dot's cabins began to have vacancies again. The riders who were still coming were the diehards, the ones who had fallen in love with Hadley, and who were stretching their summers as far as they could stretch, squeezing out one more weekend, one more ride through the hills, one more breakfast at Mabel's, before the season ended and the real world reclaimed them completely. Labor Day came, the unofficial end of summer, the last weekend. On the Sunday before Labor Day, a small group of riders, maybe a dozen of them the last regulars of the season, gathered in the park after breakfast. They did not plan it. They did not organize it. They just ended up there, the way people end up in the places where the good things happen. They sat on the benches and on the grass and on their motorcycles, and they talked softly among themselves, the way people talk when they know that something is ending and they want to hold on to it for a few more minutes. Pete, the harmonica player from Kansas City, was there. He took out his harmonica. He played a slow melody, not the blues this time, something softer, something that sounded like a farewell. The notes drifted across the park and down Main Street and into the open windows of the houses. Mabel heard it from the diner. She walked to the front door and stood there, leaning against the frame, listening. Linda came and stood beside her. They listened together. Roy heard it from the gas station. He walked to the edge of his lot and stood with his hands in his pockets, looking up the street toward the park, listening. Dot heard it from the motor court. She came out of the office and sat in the folding chair she kept by the door, and she listened. The harmonica played for about 5 minutes. Then it stopped. Pete put the harmonica back in his pocket. He stood up. He looked at the other riders. He looked at the park. He looked at the town. "Same time next year," he said. A few of the riders nodded. A few of them smiled. Nobody made a promise. Nobody committed to anything. But the question hung in the warm September air like a small flag, and everyone who heard it understood what it meant. It meant that this was not just a summer. It meant that this was the beginning of something. Something that might come back. Something that might endure. The riders got on their motorcycles. They started their engines. The deep rumble filled Main Street one more time. Smaller now. Only a dozen engines instead of 90, but still deep, still powerful. Still the sound of Harley-Davidsons doing what Harley-Davidsons do. They pulled away from the curbs. They formed a loose formation. They rolled slowly down Main Street, past the hardware store, past the barber shop, past Mabel's, past the post office, past Roy's gas station. Roy raised his coffee cup as they passed. The riders raised their hands. They rode out of town, the formation heading north, toward the highway, toward Kansas City and Springfield and St. Louis and Tulsa, and wherever else they had come from. The engine sounds faded, slowly, gradually, the way all engine sounds fade when motorcycles are moving away from you. Getting smaller, getting softer, getting thinner, until they are just a faint vibration in the air. And then, not even that, and then nothing. The main street was quiet. The parking spaces that had been filled with motorcycles for the last 3 months were empty. The curb was bare. The asphalt was bare. The only vehicles visible were the usual pickup trucks and sedans that belonged to the people of Hadley. Mabel went back inside the diner. The counter was empty. The booths were empty. The only customer was Harold Clemens, sitting at the counter drinking coffee, reading the newspaper. The diner was exactly as it had been on any given morning before the motorcycles came. Quiet, slow, half empty. Mabel poured herself a cup of coffee. She stood behind the counter and looked out the front window at the empty main street. She was quiet for a long time. "You okay, Mabel?" Harold asked. "I'm fine," Mabel said. "Just listening." "Listening to what?" "To the quiet." Harold looked at her. He looked at the window. He looked at the empty street. "Too quiet?" he asked. Mabel thought about it. She took a sip of her coffee. She looked at the window again. "It's always too quiet after something like that," she said. "But the quiet comes back either way. The question is whether you remember what it sounded like when it wasn't quiet. And I think we'll remember." She set her coffee down. She picked up a rag and began to wipe the counter. The same counter she'd been wiping for 18 years. The same rag. The same motion. The same slow, patient work of maintaining a diner in a small town that most people have never heard of. But the counter was different now. Not physically. The formica was the same. The chrome edging was the same. The small scratches and worn spots were the same. But the counter had served 1,000 new customers over the last 3 months. It had held 1,000 plates of eggs and biscuits and burgers. It had supported 1,000 elbows and 1,000 coffee cups and 1,000 brief conversations between strangers who became, over a cup of coffee and a plate of food, something slightly more than strangers. The counter remembered. Even if nobody else did, the counter remembered every rider who had leaned on it, and every plate that had slid across it, and every tip that had been left on it. The counter held those memories the way old surfaces hold the impressions of everything that has ever touched them, invisibly, permanently, in the grain of the material itself. The motorcycles did come back, not the next summer. The next summer was smaller, quieter, a few dozen riders instead of a few hundred, the word of mouth having faded slightly over the winter months. But they came back. Every summer through the 1970s, a steady stream of motorcycle riders found their way to Hadley, drawn by the roads and the food and the kindness and the reputation that the town had earned during that first remarkable summer. The numbers were never again what they had been in the last week of July 1971. The 90 Motorcycle Saturday was a once-in-a-lifetime event, the kind of peak that can only happen the first time, when everything is new and the excitement is fresh and the word is spreading at its fastest. But 30 motorcycles on a good Saturday, 20 on a regular weekday. Enough to keep Mabel's busy. Enough to keep Roy's pumps turning. Enough to keep Dot's cabins occupied. Enough to keep the town alive. Mabel ran the diner until 1983, when she was 80 years old. She retired on a Saturday morning in October, 12 years after the summer of the motorcycles. Her last day at the diner was quiet, a few regulars, a few riders who happened to be passing through, a few people from town who came in to say goodbye and to thank her for 18 years of coffee and biscuits and conversation. Mabel did not make a speech. She did not cry. She poured the last cup of coffee, washed the last dish, untied her apron, hung it on the hook behind the counter, and walked out the front door for the last time. Linda took over the diner and ran it for another 15 years, until she retired in 1998. The diner closed then. Nobody took it over. The building is still there on Main Street between the post office and the barber shop, with a faded sign above the door that says Mabel's in letters that are barely legible now. Roy ran the gas station until 1989, when he was 70 years old. He retired reluctantly because Roy was the kind of man who would have pumped gas and fixed engines until he died if his body had let him. His body did not let him. His knees gave out. His back gave out. His hands, which had held 10,000 tools and pumped 100,000 gallons of gas, developed an arthritis that made it impossible to grip a wrench. He sold the station to a younger man from the next town, a man named Dale, who was competent, but who was not Roy, and who never quite earned the loyalty of the motorcycle community the way Roy had. Roy died in 1996, at the age of 77. His funeral was attended by more than 100 people, including a dozen motorcycle riders who drove from as far as Kansas City and Tulsa to pay their respects to the gas station man who had always treated them like family. Dot closed the Pine Ridge Motor Court in 1985. She was 75 years old, and she was tired, and the cabins were too old to justify the cost of maintaining them. She sold the property to a developer who tore down the cabins and built a small storage facility on the lot, which is still there today. Dot died in 1990. She was 80 years old. She was buried in the small cemetery at the edge of town, next to her husband, who had died in 1964 and who had never seen the summer of the motorcycles. Bobby, the young man who had worked at the motor court, became a motorcycle mechanic. He went to trade school in Springfield, got his certification, and opened a small shop in the next town. He specialized in Harleys. He was good at it. He credited the riders who had come to Hadley in the summer of 1971 with teaching him everything he knew about shovelheads. He still tells people about that summer. Even now, decades later, he tells them about the 90 motorcycles on Main Street, about the music in the park, about the sunset, about Mabel's coffee and Roy's gas pumps and Dot's cabins. He tells them with the particular vividness that people bring to the stories of their youth, when everything was sharper and brighter and more meaningful than it would ever be again. And the town itself, Hadley, is still there, still in the Ozark Hills, still in the valley between the two forested ridges, still quiet, still small, still the kind of place that most people have never heard of. The main street still has the hardware store, and the post office, and the barber shop. The creek still runs along the eastern edge of town. The cicadas still sing in the summer. The church bell still rings on Sunday mornings. But there is a small plaque on the wall of the building that used to be Mabel's Diner. A simple bronze plaque about the size of a dinner plate, installed by the town council in 2001. 30 years after the summer of the motorcycles. The plaque says, in the summer of 1971, this town welcomed hundreds of motorcycle riders from across the region. For one remarkable summer, Hadley had more Harleys than cars. This plaque honors the riders who came, the townspeople who welcomed them, and the spirit of a summer that nobody who was here will ever forget. The plaque is small. Most people who pass through Hadley do not notice it. But the people who know what it means, the old-timers who were there, the riders who remember, The children who are now grandparents who still tell the story, they know. They know that on a Saturday at the end of July in 1971, a small town in the Ozark Hills had 90 motorcycles on its main street. They know that a man played harmonica in the park and the whole town came out to listen. They know that a woman named Mabel poured coffee for strangers and turned them into friends. They know that a man named Roy pumped gas and talked about engines and treated every rider with the same quiet respect he treated everyone. They know that a summer can change a town, not permanently, not dramatically, but deeply, in the way that matters, in the way that people remember. The summer of 1971, the summer of the motorcycles, the summer when a small town had more Harleys than cars, and the world, for a brief and beautiful moment, made a sound like a slow blues played on a harmonica in a small park at sunset, and everyone who heard it knew that they were hearing something they would carry with them for the rest of their lives. Good night. Sleep well. The motorcycles are gone from a main street. The diner is closed. The gas station has a different owner. The motor court is a storage facility now. But the roads are still there. The beautiful, winding Ozark roads that brought the riders to Hadley in the first place. The roads are still there, curving through the forested hills, climbing the ridges, dropping into the valleys, following the shape of the land the way rivers follow the shape of the ground. And somewhere, on one of those roads, on a warm summer evening when the light is gold and the air smells like pine and honeysuckle and warm asphalt, you can still hear it, very faintly, very far away. The deep rolling rumble of Harley-Davidsons heading south through the Ozark Hills, looking for quiet roads and quiet towns and a place to stop and rest and be welcomed by strangers. They are still out there. They are still riding. And the small town in the valley is still waiting for them, the way small towns always wait, patiently, quietly, with the porch light on and the coffee pot warm and the door unlocked. Good night.